Welcome to our discussion on the evolution and diversity of plants. This discussion is going to take us through a few different groups of plants, and we're going to use their life cycles as a way of understanding the evolution of plants away from the water into more dry landscapes. This is an example of what the Earth might have looked like during the first 3 billion years. Life had started in aquatic environments, but on land there still wasn't anything alive. This was a really big opportunity for living things. There's plenty of sunlight, there's plenty of CO2, which can be a limiting factor in growth underwater. There's also no herbivores or competition on land. The soil is rich with minerals and other things that are important for growth, but there are also some costs to growing on land. It's very dry. Gravity weighs you down. Remember, underwater, a lot of protists use gas-filled floats to keep their photosynthetic surfaces closer to the sunlight. On land, you don't have that ability. On land, if you want to grow taller, you have to fight gravity. Reproduction is another challenge on land. Remember that in water, gametes can be released into the environment, but air is much thinner than water and not nearly as buoyant. So moving gametes or reproductive propagules around on land is much more challenging. Reproduction is also important because this is the only mechanism that will allow for the evolution of new, more adapted forms. Let's explore that a little more. This was a question I proposed to you in lecture before, but how do populations adapt to new conditions? Remember, adaptation is a result of both variation and natural selection selecting upon that variation. So you need a lot of diversity in a population in order for natural selection to take effect. How can you get a lot of genetic assortment fast? Remember, if you're simply duplicating your chromosomes, your offspring will be identical to you and won't necessarily have new advantages that natural selection can select from. Sexual reproduction. What is the first step in a life cycle that leads to the random combination of two individuals' genes? Think about this. At what stage in a life cycle do we see two genes from two different organisms combined in a new way? You might be thinking of an individual stage in a process, but what is that process called? It's meiosis. As we talk about the evolution of plants, keep in mind the challenges that plants are overcoming: gravity, dry air, and reproduction. Also remember that meiosis and the random combination of new genes provides that variation and diversity that natural selection can act upon. These two things are very important in the life cycles that we'll talk about. So if plants were to conquer land, they need to adapt. With more meiotic events, the more likely an adapted form will result. We'll begin our discussion by looking at an evolutionary tree of plants. We'll begin on the bottom left and we'll move up as the lecture goes on. Plants have a green algae ancestor. We just talked about a lot of different protists, and a lot of those protists are very similar to the ancestor of all the plants. Now let's talk about the first lineage of plants. As we move up the tree, you'll see 3 branches, and those are the non-vascular bryophytes. As we talk about bryophyte life cycles, keep in mind the vulnerability of the life cycle to a dry environment and the other limitations that these life cycles have. That will help you understand how the evolution of vascular seedless plants and vascular seed plants could help plants dominate broader landscapes. What is a bryophyte? Bryo means moss and phyta means plant. You're going to hear the word phyta kind of a lot. So these are the moss plants. Here's the basic moss life cycle. I know it looks like kind of a lot here, but we'll break it down so you can understand the important things. First, that orange arrow represents a haploid life stage. That is, in this stage in the moss life cycle, the tissues only have one single set of chromosomes. They don't come in pairs. We talked about that in the protist life cycles, and that theme will continue. So, during this haploid stage, you have the production of spores, gametophytes, and eventually gametes. On the left, you can see the purple arrow. That represents a 2N diploid life stage. As we talk about these life cycles, keep in mind which stage is dominant and represents the majority of the vegetative growth. You can see that after meiosis, you have the production of spores. So we've halved the genetic information. Those spores will distribute into the environment and begin growing. The tissues that they develop are 1N. They're still haploid. They will develop into gametophytes. Those gametophytes differentiate into both male and female gametophytes. The male gametophytes contain antheridia at the top and produce sperm. The female gametophytes produce eggs in their archegonia. That's at the top of their vegetative photosynthesizing structures. Under the right conditions, the sperm can be distributed across the environment and land on the egg. When an egg is fertilized, it becomes a zygote. We're now at the bottom of the life cycle, and you can see on the bottom left a zygote. Remember, this is a tiny cell in the very top of that growing structure. The photosynthesis in this life cycle is produced by the gametophyte, the leafy part. So now that we have a 2N tissue, the zygote, it will grow into a sporophyte. That sporophyte looks a bit like a long arm that extends from the top of the female gametophyte. The sporophyte eventually differentiates at the end and creates more spores, and distributes those spores again into the environment. Now look at the moss example on the very left. We know that these are all female gametophytes because they've produced sporophytes at the top. Also note that the gametophyte tissue is haploid. That's all on the bottom, and that represents the dominant vegetative stage in moss. The sporophyte is the only tissue that's diploid. That's that little brown stick and cap on the top. That immediately goes under meiosis and releases spores, which are, again, haploid. So the only diploid structure in the moss is the sporophyte. The purpose of that sporophyte structure is to bring the spores higher up in the air column. Remember that one of the challenges on land is getting your spores or your seeds or your propagules distributed across the landscape. So why doesn't the gametophyte grow taller? Well, the gametophyte tissue lacks vascular tissue. It dries out and it's limited to very moist environments. That's why you see moss around creeks or in very sheltered, protected, and consistently moist places. Let's look at this life cycle in a more simple way so that you can really understand the relationship between haploid and diploid structures in moss. On the very left we have a spore. That spore is 1N. It's haploid. It grows into a gametophyte, and that gametophyte is also haploid. Eventually, the ovum at the top is fertilized by sperm, and a sporophyte grows. The sporophyte is 2N. That sporophyte undergoes meiosis and creates more 1N spores. This is very different than our life cycle. The dominant stage in our life cycle is 2N. It's diploid. The only 1N stage are our gametes. Plants are descendant of a lineage of algae that undergo sporic meiosis. Keep that in mind as we talk about all of the life cycles. On the bottom left is a commercial product made out of moss. Sphagnum moss has the ability to absorb water even when the tissue is dead. It's used as an additive in soils, or in this case in animal husbandry. Here we find a habitat that is really well suited to the growth of moss. Almost the entire landscape is covered in sphagnum moss. Year after year, the moss continues to grow and decay and die. As the sphagnum moss dies, it contributes to an acidic soil environment. That acidic soil inhibits the growth of a lot of plants and bacteria. The acidic soil is also a good place for more sphagnum moss to grow. And this is a good example of niche construction. That's when an organism or a population of organisms facilitates the expansion and maintenance of niche breadth. These areas are called peat bogs, and if an animal dies in that peat bog, its body is often preserved as a mummy. We've even found people in those peat bogs. This example is hundreds of years old. You can still see the red hair on the person's mustache. Decay has been limited, and this individual has been naturally mummified in a peat bog. You can learn more about that by doing a quick internet search for bog mummies.